Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sunday Forum. This morning, it is my great pleasure to have Fernando Lopez, Executive Director of San Diego Pride, in the forum. Before I turn it over to Susan Jester to introduce Fernando, let us pray. O God, from whom all good does come, grant that by thy inspiration we may think those things that are right, and by your merciful guiding may perform the same. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. And now I'd like to turn it over to Susan.
Good morning, everyone. It's an opportunity for the old warrior to introduce the young warrior. It's my great pleasure to introduce my friend and the Executive Director of San Diego Pride. Fernando's been with Pride for going on 11 years now. I was on the board 2013 to 2016, and watching the organization grow under Fernando's leadership has just been a joy to me as an old warrior. So it was with great pleasure I introduce Fernando Lopez.
Thank you. I love you, Susan. So yes, hi, my name is Fernando Lopez. I use they, them, their pronouns. I'm the Executive Director of San Diego Pride. And I've been doing this work for a little over 23 years, doing LGBT education and advocacy policy work. And in that time, there's a couple of rules I've come up with myself. Don't take meetings before 10 a.m. and don't work on Sundays. And so the only person you do that for is Susan Jester and St. Paul's and Reverend Penny Bridges, because truly, it has just been such an honor and a pleasure to see the work of Susan and Penny and St. Paul's really leaning into the social justice work, and they do so much for our community. So of course I would come on a Sunday morning for you. I absolutely love you all, and Light Up the Cathedral, which is coming up in just a few weeks, has quickly become one of my favorite Pride events every single year. It's just such a meaningful event. So I'm gonna talk through some of the history of Pride, how we sort of got to where we are as an organization, some of the things that are happening right now in the movement, and where I think some of the future is for our organization in particular. And in that, I also want to give a little additional context for some folks who might not be too familiar with me, just a little bit more about who I am and why I'm here with San Diego Pride. But even before I do that, I do want to pause and take a moment to acknowledge that today is the 6-year anniversary of the Pulse Massacre, when we lost 49 young people, predominantly, to gun violence with an automatic rifle-style weapon. And there were 49 lives that we lost that were taken too soon that day. And so if I could just take a moment to pause and reflect on that. Thank you. There's obviously a lot going on in our world, and this is why we're in this work. This is why we're in this movement, and I want to tell you a little bit about my why. So I do a lot of interfaith organizing work, as Susan knows. I say I do that because I'm an interfaith baby. I'm Jewish on my mother's side. They emigrated here from Russia and Austria, respectively, to escape the pogroms, persecution, and death that Jews were experiencing at that time. And on my father's side of the family, I'm Catholic. Mexican-American immigrant. My family came to this country to work in the fields for a better life. And so you get that good old Catholic guilt and that good old Jewish guilt. And then here you go. But they met in the Imperial Valley, and then you get me. And so from a very young age, I was told about the ways that I would experience discrimination because I'm a first-generation U.S. citizen, product of immigrants, because I'm Mexican, because I'm Jewish. And so my parents were really intentional about teaching me the ways that I would experience discrimination in the world. But what they weren't quite prepared for was having a young queer kid who's so fabulous. And so, thank you. It's early for me, I'm glad we're laughing. And really in a small town from the Imperial County, right, we all know where that is, it's the next county over. And they voted 70% in favor of Proposition E. So it was a lot of discrimination, even as a young person, the names I would be called from a very young age. And by the time I was 15, I came out of the closet. Not that I was ever really in the closet, but, and then I, like so many young folks, found myself homeless and managed to make it through school, graduated top of my class in high school, and came to San Diego as an unhoused person in the late 90s. But that's where I got a little more connected to the activism and this sort of work. And I will say that it was actually June, it was around this day. I don't remember the exact day, I didn't have a calendar to write it down, but it was about June in 2000. I was homeless and I was ready to just give up. Y'all can infer what that means, but a young activist at the time found me crying on the side of the street, put their hand on my shoulder and said, "What's wrong and what can I do to help?" And he and his mom took me in for 1 month, and it saved my life. And so I'm still here, and so I try to live my life very much in that way. What's wrong and what can I do to help? So in that work, I met who would become my husband. And every step of the way, we kept seeing, okay, these are the ways that we're not being treated equal under the law. He was fired, this is the early 2000s. The laws were new and kind of different. We didn't have a lot of protections back then. And my husband was fired from his job 3 times in 2 years because they found out that he was gay. We couldn't be on each other's health insurance at the time. I'm sure many of you remember that. And one day when he became very ill, I couldn't be by his side in the emergency room in the hospital. And that really even just further pushed me into this work. And I was like, well, I have to do something. So I ended up finding this organization called Marriage Equality USA, who was a grassroots organizing sort of around marriage specifically, and started volunteering my time with them. And we had like Gavin Newsom let same-sex couples get married in February 2004, got engaged there. The Lgbt Center here said, "You're doing great work, will you come do this with us?" And then EQCA, Equality California, who helped to pass a lot of these laws, recruited me to come and be their Southern California regional director. And so I ended up also doing a lot of that grassroots organizing, lobbying work to help pass the legislation that we would have here. And I did that for many years. I worked on Prop 8, I worked on LGBT political campaigns, and about 11 years ago, a little over 11 years ago, I got this random phone call from this person named Dwayne Crenshaw. Some of you remember Dwayne Crenshaw, who used to be our executive director. He had just been hired as our executive director, as a gay black man, as son of a Baptist minister. And we didn't know each other, really. He got my cell phone from someone else. He said, "I want to turn Pride into a year-round education and advocacy organization, and I think you're the person to do it." And I was like, "You're crazy, I'm not going over there. What are you talking about? Pride's a party, you never wanted to help." Like, we were doing some of this stuff. I was like, no, I was just hired, I have this vision, I think you're the person, will you please come? And like, let me take you to coffee and I'll convince you. Well, obviously here I am. Good job, Dwayne. What he was doing was he was building off of the legacy what others had built before, but that's how I got to Pride. And so now I'm going to take us back to why we have Pride and how that sort of organization even got there. And also, I didn't mention this, like, I feel like I'm more interesting if folks like pause me and ask questions. So if there's folks on Zoom, hi Zoom folks, type it in the chat, they'll pause me. ask a question anytime, ask me a question anytime, super fine. So, 1969. Being LGBTQ was considered a mental illness, right? It was criminalized as well. So it's really strange for us to consider that something that would be pathologized would also be criminalized. Like, if something is a health or mental health issue, we don't tend to criminalize that in society, but obviously for being LGBT at the time we did. And the other thing that was sort of interesting, I think, that was happening at the time was it was illegal to sell alcohol to people with a mental illness. So it was illegal to sell alcohol to queer people. So the only folks who would really do that at the time were, say, these underground bars, or you had to like hide that you were queer. And but the mafia was one of the groups who would own the bars and sell the drinks and water down the drinks and overcharge and like pay off the cops to leave people alone. And then they wouldn't, right? Because then we had to get sort of beaten back into submission and make sure that we weren't going to mess around with anybody. And so police raids on gay bars still happened all over the country. And in 1969, what happened at Stonewall was not the first. There were many, many raids in gay bars and LGBT bars all across the country. And so while that riot was not the first, what was sort of interesting about it is it lasted for 3 days of organizing every night and sort of holding the law enforcement at bay. And it wasn't just all bricks and like no one was throwing Molotov cocktails. It was, people were dancing in the streets and singing the can-can and teasing law enforcement. But it was all about this way to just demonstrate unity and power and visibility in the face of state-sanctioned police violence and brutality. And so LGBTQ community organizers at the time in New York were like, this was really powerful. This was meaningful. How do we commemorate this, right? How do we commemorate this really powerful moment? And so they said, well, what if we did a march? What if we did a march to honor that riot? And so what was called at the time the Gay Liberation Front formed. And this organizing body started to pop up with chapters all over the country. You know, there was no internet, so there was a lot of phone call and mail and who did you know, and there were events in Chicago in 1970, in San Francisco and Oakland, and in San Diego in 1970 as well. Reverend Troy Perry, actually I found the video, Susan, where Reverend Troy Perry in 1970 acknowledges the 1970 San Diego event. I just found it the other week, I gotta show it to you. And we honored Reverend Troy Perry here in 2017 at St. Paul's Light at the Cathedral, and he's one of the founders of MCC and really helped to organize faith communities in the LGBT community. Anyway, that was a sidebar. I will provide many of those. But at the time that March, 1970, was called the Christopher Street Liberation Day March. Called Pride. We didn't call it Pride yet. Christopher Street Liberation Day March. Not as catchy, but we knew why we were there. And in San Diego, we didn't have a march in 1970, we had a gay-in. There were a lot of gay-ins, that's what we were calling them. And so that march, that moment to commemorate when we stood up and found power and solidarity in their community, it continued to grow to city to city to city. And so in 1970, we had a gay-in, which we also were, like the Gay Liberation Front in San Diego was protesting at the San Diego Police Department because they were raiding our bars and they were entrapping us in different parts of our community. And so some of the protests were right in front of STPD. And then we had a gay-in in the park. It was really cute. Face painting, hippy-dippy, like they were like, you know, dancing in Mayflower circles, and it was great. And then in 1971, they also did another gay-in. But get this, in 1972, we didn't do a gay-in in the park. We didn't do a march. We did a conference. And I love that. I don't know why, like, it wasn't a big parade, it wasn't a festival, it was an LGBTQ rights conference for Southern California. And people from LA and Riverside and Orange County, I don't know if Imperial County was there, they weren't listed in the flyer, in San Diego, attended this conference here in San Diego to talk about how we mobilize and strategize around the LGBTQ movement. I found it to be really interesting. In 1973, we went back, we had more gay-ins, and in 1974, the Gay Liberation Front in San Diego began to shift their focus and started working on a project which was called the Center for Community Services. And that Center for Community Services is what we now know as the LGBT Center. Now, as part of that, you couldn't call things gay at the time because you couldn't write a check to anything that said gay or lesbian on it. So at the time, a lot of our older names, events, and organizations you'll see don't have the word LGBT in it, like lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender in it. And it had to do with the laws at the time not being able to say those words. But in 1974, the center had their Stonewall commemorative celebration and barbecue, where they did a potluck and a yard sale to raise money for their new and emerging center. And there were folks who were upset that we didn't yet have a march in San Diego. Why did we not have a march? So a few dozen people got together, they made signs, and they marched down the sidewalk anyway. And awesome. There was also another march in 1975, and folks sometimes get the two confused. In 1974, there was the Macy's March. And so what was happening is police were entrapping our men in Macy's. They were hooking up in the changing rooms. But they were arresting these men and publicizing their names in the paper and ruining their lives and families and careers. And so the big march that folks think about when they think about the march in 74 was actually the march against police brutality again and attacking our community again still in 1974. In 1975, a woman by the name of Jerry Dilno, who is veteran, had moved to San Diego. She had organized previously a pride in where she was from. And everyone was like, Jerry, oh my gosh, you must be the civil rights protesting expert. Come teach us your ways. And so Jerry Dilno got us the very first sanctioned permit for March in 1975. And if you look over just south of El Cajon in Texas, there's actually a street named after Jerry Dilno, and she's still over there and still awesome, by the way. But that sort of began the emergence of what our prides began to look like that were a little more similar to what we have now in San Diego. Now, at the time that first march, that first parade, started in downtown San Diego and came into Balboa Park. And then at Balboa Park, folks were like, well, we're gonna have everybody there, so we should do a rally. Well, let's talk about the issues of our movement. Let's talk about what's happening right now. Barbara Giddings was a speaker. George Raya, who was the first lobbyist for LGBT rights in Sacramento, he was a speaker. Nicole Marie Ramirez spoke. Many of you know who Nicole Marie Ramirez is. And so what I really loved about that was, where they, let's all march, and then they had their rally. That began this process of, hey, we're all here, and we all, we're marching, and we're here and having a rally. What if we tabled and had resources from our different LGBT groups here? And so people would start bringing resources and getting people registered to vote and donating to causes. Well, we've got people here, we're doing this rally, and we've got people hanging out now because there's more resources, so people are sticking around. Well, why don't we play some music? Okay, well, we're playing some music. Why don't, now people are dancing because we're playing music. Well, you know what, it's really warm, it's the summer, why don't we start bringing some beverages? Oh, well, we'll bring beverages and maybe bring some food. Okay, well, they'll bring beverages and food, and there's music and there's dancing, and then maybe we'll charge an admission ticket because up until that point, all the money was raised by selling buttons. I have the very first budget of Pride, the very first budget hanging in my office. All the income came from button sales, like a $600 budget. They had a deficit of $1. I think they were okay. But that evolution of let's keep adding different components to this march and this rally is what sort of grew Pride. Now, there were a whole bunch of contentious things in the middle, internal community fighting, political issues, and it was back when it was groups of people who would come together here and there once a year and put on this event. There wasn't a stable nonprofit organization or community group that just continued the lineage of it. So in 1989, Christine Kehoe and a few other community organizers got together, Joe Mayer, I think Jerry Dono was still involved, and they sort of said, Larry Baza, for folks who remember Larry Baza, who we lost last year, said, well, what if there was a better way to do this? It was really kind of Christine who was like, I think Christine Kehoe, who's our first LGBT elected official in the region, that there was a better way, a better model of doing this where, oh, we can actually be stable and have a full organization and make a profit. And what if we made a profit and we donated the revenue from that to the LGBT community? And so by 1994, the big sort of shift happened. It took several years to get all of that together. In 1994, that is when everything shifted. And it looks really like what Pride looks like now, where the rally is on Friday, the Spirit of Stonewall rally, we still do that, but it's on Friday now. It's moved a lot over the years. Since the flagpole was constructed, the Pride flagpole in Hillcrest was constructed 10 years ago, this year. The very first Pride flag raising was 10 years ago. We've had it over at the Pride flag, so we'll be at the Pride flag this year. So you got rally on Friday, got front runners doing their Pride 5K in the morning on Saturday. We got the parade, and then this 2-day festival in Balboa Park, which, when you think back to, okay, we had these small gains in the park, you know, we had a couple dozen people, and then it grew year after year after year, and now we are the single largest single-day civic event in the region. We're 250,000 people in attendance. We are also the most philanthropic Pride in the world at this point. We've given out more than $3 million to LGBT serving organizations here locally, nationally, and around the world. We have the largest continuous Pride staff of any Pride organization in the world. And why I say continuous is a lot of times cities will invest in their World Pride, if they have a World Pride like New York did for Stonewall 50, and they'll throw a bunch of money and they'll have a lot of staff for like 1 year. But we have over 40 year-round education and advocacy programs now. So not only when you go to the parade and the festival is it, you know, when you invest in us, when you donate to us, when there's a sponsor there, not only does it go to pay for all of that to happen, it also pays for that philanthropy that we do. So all community giving that we do, it pays for that as well, and it pays for all of our staff to work all year round on programs for interfaith work or veterans work and youth and seniors, and the women and the Latino community and the Black community, our binational work, our voter engagement, our international diplomacy work, our youth advocacy, or a lot of our direct advocacy and education work. And I'm really proud to have been a part of that. I think Christine Kehoe really was that person who sort of shifted that narrative of what a Pride could be. Larry Baza was a part of that, and really was intentional about intersectional lens to that work. He really understood the deep, thread through history of how anti-LGBTQ oppression is connected to slavery and white supremacist values and colonialism, and he really understood how we could do anti-racist work and combat misogyny and combat homophobia and transphobia and xenophobia together. And he really had that art as advocacy lens, which is why if you look at a lot of our programs, what are we? We're an arts culture organization in very many ways. The festival, it's artists, it's poets, it's authors, it's dancers, it's performing artists. It's over, I think this year we have over 177 different performances across 6 different stages and 7 different entertainment zones. There's senior services there, there's AA meetings and NA meetings, there's women's healthcare resources, there's STI and HIV services and programs. There's youth programs there. There's a children's garden for people with families, and so then that's like the direct care. Like we do this beautiful, not that I'm biased, beautiful arts and culture festival around LGBTQ arts and culture, where we pay our own community to do this beautiful work and showcase their talents. And so the folks who love like us and look like us are the people who are represented on those stages. And then as we get people there, we connect them to those direct services and care and those resources. But we're also connecting them to the nonprofit groups, the advocacy groups who are there as well, who are tabling and registering voters and connected to the activist organizations who are doing their work and try to cultivate that leadership and that advocacy together. So it's just really beautiful, I think, to have been a part of developing that ecosystem of art, advocacy, civic engagement, philanthropy, and how it can all weave together and support itself. And I'm grateful to Dwayne for reaching out 11 years ago and saying we have this vision. And I think, I take all of that and I look at, again, who I am as a person and where my parents came from and what they taught me and the values they instilled in me. And being an LGBT person, having formerly been homeless, having worked on this advocacy and lobbying and legislative work for our community, doing grassroots organizing, all of that work really helped as I came to San Diego Pride. And we said, well, what if we looked at the intersection of diverse communities and what is it that these specific groups need, right? Communities of faith might need something, women's communities might need something, youth might need something. And so we really work with each one of these groups in that they volunteer to build their own programs. So I'll use our She Fest program, our women's program as an example. The committee who does that, I don't tell them what to do. Like, I'm the boss, I have 20 bosses. I have a board of directors that I have to listen to. But this committee that we run, this program that we run, it's 20-some women who create their own programs and they work collaboratively to decide what is it that the women's community really needs? How do we want to showcase women in our community? And so that's them coming up with their stuff, and my job is to make sure they have the funding, the resources, the infrastructure to make all of that possible. So as they're envisioning what and how to best serve their community, we can fund that. And then, so that is true of each of our programs. Each of our programs is predominantly run by volunteers. The staff are employed there to utilize our staff time, our paid time, to find the funding, to pay for the things, to do the administrative work, to do the graphic design, to help with the volunteer management and recruitment and the outreach. But really, those programs are developed by the folks in our community. So we have pivoted into this really deeply into this advocacy work, and I'm really proud that we do, because this is a really challenging moment in our movement. Depending on what news you're watching right now, or you're seeing stuff, and ever since the Trump administration, actually even since he began to run for office, really shifted a narrative towards fascism and the return of white supremacy, and what continued to be uplifted by the Trump administration was this really hyper-misogynistic values, very racist values, anti-LGBT, anti-trans, and so many of us saw the writing on the wall, and we're like, this feels too familiar. And maybe, again, as part of my Jewish heritage, is this doesn't feel right. This doesn't sound right. And since he began to run for office, violent crime was on the rise, hate crimes were on the rise, and particularly targeting communities of color, Jewish communities, and the LGBT community. Hate crimes just in the last year in San Diego are up 66%. And I know, we've made so many victories and there's been so much progress, but the reality is right now is a really terrifying time even for me, working in, being in a safe space, in a safer state, in a safer community. But, there was a gay man that was slashed in the face just a couple months ago, just for being gay, a scar across his face now. There was a group of women who were held with gunpoint last year. We saw these churches attacked. last year here in San Diego that had Black Lives Matter and pro-LGBT signs in front of them. Just this last week, our building was tagged here in San Diego. And some of you may have seen that in Idaho yesterday, there were 31 white supremacists who were arrested, who they were planning to engage in a riot or something at this Idaho Pride celebration. And thankfully, authorities caught them before they did anything. And I say that to keep it real. I say it because, folks hear me talk a lot about white supremacist values and don't necessarily, they think, I'm talking about racism. No, I'm talking very specifically about white supremacist organizations working very intentionally to instill their values and views and radicalize folks using particularly social media to organize broadly, but they have very specific goals and tactics. So for years, they actually had a name for part of the project, which is called Project Blitz. And so part of that was to work with legislators on judicial appointments to ensure that at all different levels, anti-LGBT, anti-women, anti-choice, anti-immigrant, anti-voting rights, pro-gun judges were placed all over the country. And they were really specific about where they did their placements. And the next part of that was that they would enter in and use faith as a guise, these really banal sort of seeming pieces of municipal code or county codes, and to just try to test the waters in certain districts about where they could challenge sort of these religious focused, seemingly innocuous pieces of legislation and challenge up through judicial court systems. And then once those happened first, that's why they tested the waters there, and now you're seeing hundreds of pieces of anti-LGBTQ legislation entered last year and this year. Last year was the highest number of anti-LGBTQ pieces of legislation ever entered in American history. This year is now the highest. Again, hundreds of pieces of legislation. And it is terrifying. Many of you, I think, saw the leaked Supreme Court document around repealing abortion rights in this country, repealing Roe v. Wade. And for folks who read more deeply into the ruling, expressly named in there was the right to marry. But more terrifying for me, and I think many of us, was Lawrence v. Texas. And so Lawrence v. Texas, for folks who don't know what Lawrence v. Texas is, was that it was only 2003. Lawrence v. Texas was ruled in 2003, and it decriminalized homosexuality in the United States. And to think it wasn't that long ago, 2003 wasn't that long ago, literally the case had to do with two men being intimate in their room, in their own home, in their bedroom, and police knocking down the door and arresting them. 2003, not that long ago. I think everyone here in this room was alive in 2003. And we have made so much progress, and it's hard to reflect and think in this moment that that is what is on the line, the recriminalization of the LGBT community, but that is what is happening right now. Some of these pieces of legislation that are being entered in Alabama and Tennessee and Texas are talking about prison time. Prison time for our community, or for the parents of our trans youth who are just seeking medical support and mental health care. And so there was this story that came out of Texas, and I'm sorry, I'm going to keep it really real, but when this legislation passed, there was a young trans man who was just so grieved by this legislation, he attempted to take his own life. And so he went to the hospital, and as the parents were explaining what was happening, and they realized that this young man was trans, the parents were taken by child protective custody because they were trying to take care of his son. This is happening now. And, I want to say, okay, what are we doing? What are we doing about it? And we can say, go vote. I mean, yes, vote is really important. but engaging throughout the year in your friends and your family and your places of work and your colleagues in the media, engaging with a campaign that is your values. There's a million ways to engage, but I think at this point, not doing anything, like doing nothing, is unacceptable. I mean, like, you're all obviously here, and I appreciate that. And how do you educate the folks around you about the reality that our community is facing? I mean, California right now is working on passing asylum status legislation for trans youth and their families. There are 19 other states that are joining them, so like hope is not lost, but why are we even having this conversation that in our own country we're talking about creating an internal asylum and refugee status for citizens of our own country? And again, I say, like, as a Jew, as an interfaith person, as all the identities that I have, like, the warning signs have been in front of us, and I don't know that it's being addressed at the scale that we really need to address that. But I'm proud to say that we are doing that, and that San Diego has become this beautiful hub of tolerance and acceptance, and we're doing pretty good, right? We've got our first openly LGBTQ mayor of color, really awesome, Mayor Todd Gloria. We have, I don't know if you know this fun fact, more LGBTQ elected officials in San Diego region than anywhere in the country. Like, we're doing the work in San Diego. San Diego is the first city in the country and pride in the country to have our veterans and service members march freely and openly in the parade. That was 11 years ago. That happened before the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Just like this is the 10-year anniversary of the Pride flagpole in Hillcrest. It is also the 10-year anniversary of having the first street named after Harvey Milk. It is the 10-year anniversary of the first time service members were permitted by the Department of Defense to wear uniforms in the Pride Parade. It's the first time that happened anywhere in the country. It was 10 years ago. And actually, this will be the first year we have a marching band from the Marines coming. It's really exciting. We haven't even announced that yet, so you got to hear it here first. Hi, sorry. You get to hear it first. And then also we have this wonderful program at San Diego Pride called the Pride Youth Leadership Academy. And this is its 10-year anniversary as well. And it's one of my favorite programs. I'll tell you why. So we take LGBTQ youth, well, we don't take them. Actually, how it started, let me tell you about the founding. We used to have this program called the Leadership Academy, and our youth were like, you have this Leadership Academy for adults. We want one for youth. I'm like, okay, let's do that. What do you want? Like, what do you want to see in this Youth Leadership Academy? So they helped develop their own curriculum. And they asked for things like what we do now, which is they wanted to learn about their history. Our youth actually want to learn about our history, believe it or not. Like, it's not really taught in schools, and they want to learn that. They wanted to learn about the resources that are out there for LGBTQ youth. They wanted to learn about the laws and policies that many of us fought so hard to actually have. And they wanted to learn the real core fundamental leadership skills that will help them develop and help them be a part of this relay race of intergenerational movement building that we're all a part of. And so it went from this really small group, it was like 12 kids, and now it was like over 100 people last year. And we keep adding, and so it's junior high through high school age youth. This year's the first year we're adding transitional age youth, which is like 18 to 24, so like sort of college age youth. But we also have a parent track and an educator track. So that way the parents can learn how to be their best advocates, and the teachers can learn what is there so they can fight back in their schools. Because, here's what sort of happens, right? We pass all this legislation, and then nobody knows how to implement it, and it doesn't get implemented at schools, and it doesn't get implemented for our kids. And so now we're teaching them, and they want to learn. And so this year, we're hoping for 250 kids. It's going to be at City College downtown. The new chancellor, Carlos Cortez, for the Unified Community College District, Community College District, Carlos Cortez, openly gay man, he's donating the space. And so it's just this really wonderful thing in San Diego where we get connected, we know each other, we support each other, we lift each other up. And if you have a chance, if you know any LGBTQ educators, parents of LGBTQ kids, or LGBTQ youth, please send them down. It's like one of my favorite days of the year to see that many young people excited and engaged in being the next generation of our movement. Let's see. Now, finally, I have to look at my notes. So we're in the beginnings of developing a new strategic plan for the organization. I don't know how many people nerd out about strategic plans, but I sort of do. Again, I think about what Larry Baza and Christine Kehoe brought to this organization, what Dwayne Crenshaw and the board at the time really re-envisioned this organization to be. And about 6 years ago, the board did it again, and how can we refocus what is it that we want to be as an organization? And Susan, there we go. It was like 2016, we went into that last process of what resources do we have as an organization and how can we best utilize that strategically? Eventually how I ended up becoming executive director about 4.5 years ago was this redoubling down of we want to do education and advocacy work. And so one of the things that we are about to do is we're taking input from the community on what does the community want to see us become. There's a survey, I'll make sure we get it back sent out over to Susan in St. Paul's if you all want to fill it out. We want to hear from everyone in our community about what do you see for the future of our organization and how can we make those adjustments and changes based on what the community would like. One of the other really exciting things for me is that we get asked to engage in a lot of policy work and a lot of direct advocacy, and sometimes it's hard to understand how things are LGBTQ issues. And you'll say, "Oh, we want you to take a stand on this, and we want you to take a stand on that." And it's hard to say, "Well, where's the line?" We'll hear some folks like, "Well, that's a race issue. That's not an LGBTQ issue," or "That's homelessness. That's not an LGBT issue." And we're like, wait. All issues to us are LGBT issues if we find the right policy and research and data, because we are a marginalized community who is disproportionately impacted in a lot of different ways. And so we just released this new project called the Pillars of Justice. And what it is it's a deep policy analysis across multiple different issues through an LGBTQ intersectional lens. So the research are there, the policies are there, the data are there, but no one has collected them, except we're doing it here in San Diego, and I'm really excited about that. So it's disability justice, economic justice, environmental justice, gender justice, health justice, racial justice, and reproductive justice. Those are the 7 key pillars. Because we can look at each and every one of those, and not that those are all the issues out there, but that at least gives us an initial framework of how to look at these issues and topics from an LGBTQ policy and research lens, and then go out and educate folks about that and implement those policy best practices, yes, here in San Diego, but to give them freely to other LGBT organizations across the country and around the world so they can use them as a framework as well. So again, when you're investing in San Diego Pride, that's sort of the work that we get to do. And we got about 14 minutes left, so I'll tell you one more thing that I really love about this work, and please, then I'll shut up, but you ask me questions or something. So the mission statement at San Diego Pride is fostering pride, equality, and respect for all lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender communities locally, nationally, and globally. It's not just words. Obviously, we do an immense amount of local work all year round. Nationally, there are so many ways that we engage nationally in shifting policy, but I'm going to take a minute to talk about the international component. So Doug Moore, a San Diegan, one of our former board members, he's also still around, still awesome. In 1981, he was like, what if all these pride organizations started talking to each other and meeting and supporting one another? And so he started making a list. All good things start with a list. Started making a list of these pride organizers and their phone numbers and addresses. And it turns out there was another gal in Boston who was doing the same thing. And so they got together. Her name is Marsha Levine. She's also still around. And they were like, okay, what did we all start talking? So in 1982, a handful of them met in Boston, like in her living room. And we're like, okay, we're going to do something. Like, we're going to meet, we're going to start doing things, we're going to get together. And in 1983, the first like conference was in San Diego. And it's called, back then it was called the National Pride Conference. They've since shifted their name. It's now called Interpride. It's the International Pride Association, connecting thousands of prides all over the world as we support each other. Because, what's happening, right now in Ukraine, what's happening in Ukraine or what's happening in Slovenia or Malta or, South Africa, or what is happening in, Bolivia, maybe was happening to us or somewhere else. And so we can share best practices and resources and advocacy. And as there was a shift under the Obama administration as well, and a better focus on LGBTQ issues, we started to partner with the Department of State, actually, on reaching out with these delegates from around the world. So at this point, I think I've met with like 540 some delegates from 140 countries around the world. And that's what Pride is doing on LGBTQ issues and through the Department of State. So this international, we actually really do engage in this beautiful international work. And next year, in 2023, we will be hosting the 40th anniversary of the International Conference right back here in San Diego, where we look to bring about 1,000 people from around 140 countries around the world to come and be here, be activists, and learn from each other. And under this administration, the Biden administration, we have a lot of additional support as well. There's actually an Office of LGBTI Affairs under this White House, which is the first time that's ever happened. And there is an office, or there's a special envoy on LGBTQ civil rights. And I'm happy to say that Reggie Greer from the Office of International LGBT Rights for the Department of State will be our keynote speaker this year at the rally. So I hope you come and hear from him and engage in this work. So I do want to hear any questions you might have. So thank you for your time. That was my local, national, international Pride stuff. Thank you. Yes, here and then Susan.
I'm not clear exactly how you interface with the center.
Oh, wonderful. So the LGBT Center is one of our longest and strongest... Sorry?
Could you repeat the question?
Oh, the question was, how do we engage with the LGBT Center? So the LGBT Center is one of our longest and strongest LGBT community partners. So what they really focus on is a lot of that mental health, crisis intervention, direct service and care, right? And so what we do is a lot of the arts and culture, leadership development sort of work. Now, where we are together, we're together on a lot of stuff, and we refer each other back and forth to all kinds of things. But I think where we are strongest is in our advocacy work. So they have a chief public affairs officer, we have a director of education and advocacy, and they work hand in hand quite frequently on any sorts of issues that might be happening. They work together on voter engagement, and we coordinate our voter engagement efforts, so like no one's stepping on each other's toes and we're helping each other be better. Whenever there is a big moment of community crisis or celebration or protest, it's not just the LGBT Center and us that do it. We typically will take the lead in rallying our community organizations together. But it's one of the things, again, I really love about San Diego is we also have what's called the Community Leadership Council, which is a program of this center. They've been meeting now for 19 years. Next year's 20. And I've been going to 18 years of those meetings. But it is all the different LGBT organizations in the region who we meet together once a month to talk about what are the issues that our community is facing and how can we strategize to best address those together. A few of the big things that have happened over the years, as far as policies regard, obviously we work together on Don't Ask, Don't Tell, marriage equality, the rise of meth use and addiction in our community, HIV and STIs, and youth empowerment and advocacy are some of the strongest ways that we've done that. Thank you for asking. Susan, have a question?
Fernando, would you talk a little bit about your historic creation of the DeVal program, interfaith relationships with Pride? Nobody else in the country does that, I don't believe.
Sure, thank you for asking. So I was about to do that. Yeah, thank you, because you gave me that note. I appreciate it. So Susan asked me about our interfaith organizing work and how we started that interfaith organizing work and what that sort of looks like. So again, I go back to, I grew up, because I had Jewish mother and Catholic father, I grew up reading all different texts of faith, Old Testament, New Testament, Torah, different versions of the Bible, the Book of Mormon, I get Quran, I go on and on. And so when I started doing this marriage equality work, some of our biggest opponents were leaders of faith. And so thankfully I had some language around faith, so when we would be in debates together, I actually knew how to sort of address many of these issues. But you quickly learn that the best person to talk directly to a faith leader is a faith leader. And that faith is so often used as a weapon against us when really it should be one of the things that lifts us up. It should be one of the things that supports us. It should be a healthy, healing thing for our community. And so in the early 2000s, I started a lot of interfaith organizing. St. Paul's was a part of that. UU was a part of that. Unitarian Universalist Church, MCC was a part of that. Mission Gathering, and on and on. And we brought, and so when I moved over to San Diego, Pride, it was one of the things that I saw was missing. And I said, we need to do interfaith organizing here. And so we started with a few different interfaith pavilions. And then it was actually Brandon Robertson at the time came and he said, we need to lean a little more into the social justice work. And so we restarted, but it was Susan, really in your vision, with Penny and here to do Light at the Cathedral, and we're gracious enough to then incorporate this interfaith advocacy component with this celebration component, and have this be this thoroughfare. And that with Light at the Cathedral, we're not just coming around and praying, and it's not about one faith, it's about interfaith, but we really try to send a clear and direct message through that interfaith work. And so there are years where we were very specific about saying these are the faith leaders who were pushing for LGBT rights broadly or marriage equality specifically. But oddly, like the year of the Chabad shooting in 2019, we had already selected, we had seen the rise in anti-Semitism, so we had already selected Jewish faith leaders, and we had selected Jewish Family Services, the awardee that year. And then 2020, we had already selected Black community members and leaders and faith leaders to address the rise in anti-Black violence, and then George Floyd happened. And this year, we're really using Light at the Cathedral to shine a light on the border crisis and our refugees and asylees that have been, in particular, our LGBT and trans refugees and asylees who've been stuck at the border under some terrible policies. And so it's been a joy to see how we can bring together all of these different faith groups who might seem so disparate, but recognizing that we have shared values and that the LGBT community has shared values with communities of faith, because so often we are told that we do not, that we are antithetical to each other's existence, that being LGBT is somehow inherently a moral failure, when the reality is that we are people of faith and made in the image of God, and that no one can separate that from us. And part of the very First Amendment, like in the Constitution, grants us, like, LGBT rights are religious freedom rights. Religious freedom rights are LGBT rights. They are not in opposition. And I love that now North County is doing a Light at the Cathedral, and we're talking about how do we take what we do here at St. Paul's and really bring that out to the rest of the world, similar to what we're doing with the rest of this work. Thank you for that question, Susan. Yes. Yeah. So we don't have. Yes. Oh. Yes. Okay, but I would love to explain. Oh. Okay, so the question was around, so. Thank you. So I just want to share the question briefly, and I will answer because there is a deeper conversation. So the question was around whether or not we use our funds or resources to support people who are incarcerated. So we actually do that in a whole host of different ways. We assist with legal referrals. We have had direct partnerships with the Tom Homan Law Association, which is the LGBT Law Association. And so, again, these issues of discrimination are happening all of the time. I think I did at least 2 legal referrals this last week. So that is one of the key ways that we do that. We also fund many of the people and organizations who do this work directly. And part of that strategic plan development work is around looking at expanding what we call access to justice. And so there's an access to justice. What that means is so many folks can't actually afford legal support or counsel, and particularly low-wage workers, which disproportionately are folks who are LGBT, transgender, or gender nonconforming individuals. So thank you again for bringing up that point, because that legal discrimination does happen all of the time. And one of the other ways that we engage directly in that work is many of our staff are the ones who do the LGBTQ competency training for our different law enforcement agencies, including the Sheriff's Department, which disproportionately, again, there's transgender folks and LGBTQ folks who are treated poorly within the carceral system. And so we do a lot of the cultural competency work as a harm reduction tactic, so that way at least the people who are incarcerated for whatever reason, they hopefully are treated a little better while they're incarcerated. I do believe that is our time, but I'm sticking, oh, Susan? Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah, Pride's coming up. It's only a few days away. She-Fest is just less than a month away, which is our women's festival, which is the Saturday before the parade. We've got Light at the Cathedral here, which is the 13th, Wednesday the 13th. Rallies the 15th. Then, of course, all the big Pride stuff that you know that weekend. sdpride.org. You can just search San Diego Pride on the website. It'll come right up. We're always looking for volunteers. There's a million things to do. I'm really grateful for your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was a privilege to have you here this morning as our guest speaker, Fernando. Next week, June 19th, Juneteenth, we welcome guest preacher, the Reverend Dr. Mark Andrew Jefferson. He'll preach at the 8 o'clock and the 10:30 a.m., and he'll also lead the 9 a.m. forum in person. Happy Sunday.